All right, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you all. So again, my name is Josh Gilmartin, representing ATL, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. I work for Airside Operations as the certification and training coordinator. So we're here this afternoon to discuss taxiway designation practices, how that translates to airfield safety, and then all of this uh, to work to prevent any sort of airfield incidents up to and including runway incursions on the airfield. So a quick agenda here of everything that we're going to talk about: developing taxiway designations, general FAA standards for taxiways, ATL's taxiway nomenclature, how that relates to airfield safety and construction, how all of that comes together in preventing runway incursions, and then rounding it out with a quick discussion on training. So before we get going here, just an overview of where everything I'm going to talk about related to taxiway nomenclature came from. So the three sources that we're using today is the Federal Aviation Regulation Part 139, Subpart D on operations, the FAA Advisory Circulars 150 series, the standards for airport sign systems, which goes into specific details on taxiway nomenclature. And then lastly, FAA Engineering Brief number 89A, which is even more specific guidance on taxiway nomenclature conventions at airports. So FAA provides very light, very minor guidance on how exactly the airfield should be named. But what little guidance they do provide indicates that your naming convention should be logical. You want to facilitate efficient ground navigation for aircraft utilizing the airfield, and then allow for uniformity of taxiway nomenclature. And by that I mean keeping it standardized from airport to airport. The nomenclature system that one airport uses shouldn't be different than that of another airport. Because we're all working together to promote situational awareness, ensuring that the flight crew that flies from one airport is not going to be confused when they get to the next airport. And then, of course, reducing the risk of navigational error that may lead to runway incursions. And so below here, I provided two diagrams. The one on the left is an old airfield diagram from ATL back in 2007, I think was the year that I selected. And as you'll notice in the highlighted red area, there's one taxiway that goes all the way down there, taxiway Dixie, versus on the right side diagram, which is a current diagram from today, where the taxiway has been renamed to the standard name, which is, of course, taxiway Delta. So the historical background behind all that was ATL is, of course, Delta Airlines' largest hub. And therefore, they thought back in the day that having a taxiway named Taxiway Delta would confuse the airline Delta pilots. Uh, so going way back into the 80s, Taxiway Delta at ATL was always called Taxiway Dixie. And this was one of the only airports in the world that had a different name for the taxiway. So we in airside operations, of course, are always trying to maintain compliance with the FAA regulations and what they recommend we do. And they started asking the question to us one day, well, why do you have a different name for this taxiway? Is there a reason for it? And when we started to look into it and realized that all of Delta Airlines' other hubs, Taxiway D was named Taxiway Delta, not Taxiway Dixie. We elected to make the decision to change it to promote that uniformity across airports. And so that was in October of 2020 that we made that change. And then here we are in November of 2024 and haven't had any issues with any flight crews, any confusion or anything since then. So that was a positive change we could make to bring more uniformity among ATL and other airports to prevent any flight crew confusion. So I provided a snippet here of an area in the FAA regulation that I wanted to highlight. Consider the following factors when deciding to implement a change to existing taxiway designation. The changes should be made incrementally over time to minimize any operational disruptions. So again, just a snippet of some of the chart changes that we've made here that would reflect that. So we did a construction project where we relocated one of our taxiways 129 feet to the east, which required us changing it from taxiway Delta, taxiway Dixie to taxiway Alpha 7 because it was now too far from the other taxiway to maintain that same naming convention. So when we gave the taxiway stub a new name, it then had a pretty dramatic implication in the sense that we had to also rename three other taxiways. What was Alpha 7 got moved over and therefore had to become Alpha 11, Alpha 13, and Alpha 15 going down the line. So this was a good example of why it's important to make changes over time because doing something as simple as changing four taxiway names could have a pretty substantial impact to all of the aircraft users that are accustomed to parking in that area. What was taxiway Alpha 7 is no longer Alpha 7 and is now Alpha 11. So without proper communication, making those small changes and really, really harping on those small changes to ensure that the flight crews understand what the changes are, that could have had a pretty substantial impact. But luckily, we haven't had any issues from that. So all this to say, whenever you are making changes, it's important to make those small incremental changes over time rather than one big change to the whole airfield that could really throw off a flight crew. So next, let's look at a little bit of ATL's taxiway nomenclature. So 23 primary taxiways, those are our single letter designation taxiways, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, etc. And then 74 connector taxiways, which connect the primary taxiway to another piece of pavement, another taxiway, a ramp, or a runway. And those connector taxiways have that primary taxiway letter that they stem from plus a number. Then two end-around taxiways, very important to us here, Taxiway Victor and Taxiway Whiskey. Their sole role is to link the outboard runways to the inboard taxiways so that the aircraft arriving would never have a reason to cross the open runway, which is a big win for the airport because the airport can push a lot more airplanes through in an hour without them having to sit and wait to cross a runway. It's a big win for the airlines because they're not burning gas just sitting there waiting to cross a runway. And then, of course, it's a big win for the passengers who look out the windows of the aircraft and see that the airplane is moving rather than sitting and waiting to cross a runway. So all around win with those two very important pieces of pavement. The primary taxiway names are mostly north to south. And by that, I mean taxiway Alpha is up on the north side of the field, taxiway Bravo, Charlie Delta, the geometry kind of works southbound until you get to the South Airfield where the Sierra taxiways, Sierra Charlie, Sierra Juliet, the S is in front of those taxiway names to indicate that they're on the South Airfield. We also have an acronym that we give out to new airfield users. We call it the NOSE acronym, which helps with consistency across the airfield. So let's use taxiway Bravo as an example. The primary taxiway being Bravo, and then all of the connector taxiways off of taxiway Bravo will follow the NOSE acronym, north odd, south even. So odd numbered taxiways north of the primary, even numbered taxiways south of the primary. And we maintain that consistency for the most part across the airfield. And again, that helps with that consistency aspect. So the flight crews, and airport users on the movement area will have an understanding of what they can expect, not what makes sense to us. And then lastly, no number 8s and no number 9 taxiway connectors. So you'll never see a Bravo 8 or Lima 9, anything to that effect. And that's to prevent any confusion with the runway numbers, 8s, 9s. And then on the South Airfield, you won't see a 10. So ATL's taxiway naming convention all started with one of these, a taxiway nomenclature study. And then we update the taxiway nomenclature study every so often to reflect necessary changes. So just a high level overview here of some of the upcoming changes that will need to be made incrementally as we complete projects on various parts of the airfield through time. So most of them related to non-alphanumeric runway entrances. In other words, a taxiway that meets the approach or departure end of a runway that needs to have a letter and a number rather than just a letter. Uh, Double different alphabet characters. The FAA encourages airports to use Same double letter taxiways, so Sierra, Sierra, Charlie, Charlie, Juliet, Juliet, but not Sierra, Charlie, or Sierra, Juliet, because that could promote some confusion among flight crews. And then three-letter designations, which we have a whole lot of. Those are the green ones. Uh, they encourage you to keep it short and simple, but on an airfield as large as ATL's, we don't ever foresee that being a realistic solution for us here, where we can eliminate that one completely. But again, things that are continually monitored over time for upcoming changes that we might be able to make. Okay, so now let's talk about how all of this can tie into construction. So by and large, ATL's taxiway nomenclature makes sense. It flows relatively easily. And putting that into perspective, there have been very few historical incidents attributed to flight crews being confused because of the way the airfield was named or numbered. But of course, construction, including any airfield geometry changes and any taxiway nomenclature changes, are going to be a really easy catalyst to confuse a flight crew. So now I just want to highlight some events that have happened at ATL, not necessarily because of the name of the taxiway, but just because of some geometry configuration changes that have led to some issues for us. So the first one I'll highlight has to do with one of our taxi islands. So it all began when an airline alleged that several pilots have filed safety reports concerning the close proximity of a taxiway sign in one of the airfield's islands. So at first we were scratching our heads, what could be the issue here? Why would they be thinking a sign was too close to the aircraft as long as they're staying on the pavement? So once we went out there, we were able to very easily see aircraft tires through a no taxi island, indicating, okay, we do have an issue here. Aircraft are taxiing in an area that they're not supposed to be taxiing. And then we were able to confirm that with our surface movement system that was showing trends of aircraft taxiing in the middle of the island rather than around the island the way that they're designed and intended to. So then we began asking ourselves the question, well, what would be causing this issue? So looking at the left side of the screen is the old taxiway Victor geometry, where you can see the taxiway lines up with the west line of ramp 1 north here, versus the right side picture where the taxiway has been realigned and now lines up with the east line taxi line. So, of course, aircraft are taxiing through the historical pavement the way that they're used to doing it, rather than the way that the taxiway is currently designed. And then this in red being the sign that they were saying was in close proximity to the aircraft, which of course, as the airplane is taxiing through an airline, or excuse me, through an island that they're not supposed to be, there would be a sign there that would be too close for comfort for them. So then we began asking ourselves the question, well, what can we do to fix this issue? Because you can't just tell every pilot out there, don't do that anymore. We've got to put up some sort of barrier that wouldn't pose an even greater impact to the aircraft. So we reviewed specs for additional edge lights that were already there. The circles already existed, but we looked at adding reflectors that would stand out of the ground and be a little bit more prominent, especially at night. And then also adding taxiway shoulder markings, which we don't have anywhere else on the airfield. But we thought that perhaps since we don't have them anywhere else on the airfield, that by adding them in this one location, it would make them even more prominent and easy to identify. So here's a drone overhead picture of what the island looked like after we had installed the markings. And then you could almost discern the taxiway center line that used to run through there, that connected with the old taxiway geometry before we relocated the taxiway. So it's not really difficult to see why flight crews are making the issue. It just became more of a, okay, this is a safety hazard because of airfield construction that we did. Now we got to work to prevent anything even more catastrophic from happening. And then here's a photo from the ground level view of the reflectors that we added, as well as the new edge markings, or excuse me, shoulder markings. And ever since we put in those new fixtures, we haven't had any aircraft taxi through the island. No more complaints. That really did wonders to resolve our issue. So a little bit of paint, a small investment in some reflectors, which is not a very big investment at all, really went a long way to promote airfield safety. And then we didn't stop just there. We also wanted to get the word out to the pilots. So the best way that we have found to get that word out to the pilots is to put it in their charts. So making some phone calls to our local airline partners to ensure that they had it not only in their local pages. This is a snippet from one of the airlines pages where they added "Do not taxi across islands. Remain on the taxiway center line," and then highlighted the area at hand. So it was right in front of the flight crews that would be flying into Atlanta. They could pull up the charts while they were taxiing and see that this is an issue and work to ensure that it wouldn't become an issue. And then the chart on the right is from our partners at Jeppesen, who do a lot of charting for a lot of airlines worldwide, to add a chart to ATL's chart set specific to ATL, so that any crews with any airlines that use Jeppesen charts could pull this up and see that there is an island hashed out here, indicating flight crews are advised not to mistake the painted no taxi island for a taxiway. And then they also went so far as to include the correct taxi in procedures to ensure no one's tempted to take any shortcuts or anything like that. So again, that communication, working with our partners, not only communicating with the airlines, but also actively putting physical barriers out there, uh, really, really went a long way. And then the second one that I wanted to highlight was a procedural turn issue that we were having. So it all centers around aircraft that were making this acute angled left-hand turn from taxiway November, which runs east-west, onto taxiway Juliet, which runs north-south here. So an overview of what the taxiway looks like. As you can see, there is no taxiway center line that links the two taxiways. In other words, it's not designed for aircraft to make that turn. And what we were seeing was it was very obvious to us that aircraft were making that turn because of the condition of the pavement that deteriorated incredibly rapidly. In just a matter of a couple of days, we were noticing that the pavement was totally obliterated, and the pictures really don't even do it justice for just how poor it was. But again, this is not an issue that we just go out and fix and then don't say anything about. So our immediate knee-jerk reaction was to make sure that all pilots flying into Atlanta would see uh, do not turn left from taxiway November onto taxiway Juliet for airport ops due to pavement condition and excessive turn angle. Expect to cross at a different location. Advise ATC unable if instructed to make this turn. And we've made sure that this message was included in all of the airline's instructions for any pilot that was flying into ATL. And then once the next charting cycle was implemented, we added a new remark so that it became the law of the land and then ended up in all airport chart sets that went out to all airlines to ensure that all flight crews knew that they could not and should not make that turn. And again, since we've had that issue and gone out there and made those pavement repairs, we haven't had that issue again. So how does all this tie into runway incursion prevention? Airfield changes over time should be made in conjunction with airfield construction. That's the easiest way to ensure that you're not used to looking at it one way, then the next day the taxiway's got a new name, the geometry's been changed, so on and so forth. Everything should be done as even keel and buttoned up as they possibly can, and then communicate whenever there are changes. The big players for us here at ATL are our air traffic control tower, any of the airport stakeholders, and then the aircraft charting agencies. Those are the three entities we think about anytime we've got any sort of change. So on the right side of the screen is an example of a construction chart that we designed and implemented with Jeppesen. So we were doing some construction on one of our ramps and had different taxi-in procedures and different parking procedures for aircraft that were going to use the ramp. And in just the matter of an afternoon, again, our partners at Jeppesen were able to use the construction drawings from the project to mock up this diagram. And this is just a temporary chart with an expiration date that coincides with when construction is scheduled to finish, but it could be easily pulled sooner or extended longer if need be. And this is just a great example of an easy solution for when you do have airfield geometry changes or nomenclature changes. If you put it in the charts that all the pilots who operate at the airport are going to see, it becomes very easy for them to expect it. Oh, okay, I see it in the construction diagram. Now I'll look for it on the field, and therefore the confusion is severely reduced. So it all works again in conjunction with training being the most paramount thing that you can offer to make sure that the users of the airport are going to remain safe. So a very high level overview of our two different training programs. We have non-movement area training, which is a robust computer-based training video with quizzes that's targeted at keeping non-movement area drivers off of the airfield with a strong emphasis and a lot of repetition on the visual cues to look out for. When you're driving on the airport's roadways, you look out for the movement area boundary markings and ensure you don't cross them. You make sure that you're staying within the confines of the vehicle service roadways, and then highlighting any potential confusion areas. And then our movement area training is, of course, a very robust in-person classroom training with two quizzes at the end that's targeted at movement area drivers, knowledge of the airfield concepts, their ability to communicate with air traffic control, and to coexist on the movement area safely with live aircraft. And then the strong emphasis from that class is on the advanced airfield concepts and users' demonstrated ability to communicate effectively on the aviation radio. And that, again, just a high level overview of what training at ATL looks like. So as a recap, airfield construction is inevitable. It's going to happen. Construction welcomes airfield geometry and any sort of nomenclature changes. A designation system that flows well and is easy to understand will go a very long way. Any changes should be made incrementally over time to ensure that you're giving your tenants and your stakeholders and your flight crews plenty of time to see what the changes are, to plan for them, and so that you're not overwhelming the whole airport by making big changes overnight. Communication with tenants and stakeholders is, of course, very important. They need to know when changes are coming so they can teach their personnel how to operate safely in those areas. Get the information out to flight crews and air traffic control. They're your partners. They're the ones who matter the most when it comes to airfield safety. And then you can't train enough. That is the one tool in everyone's tool belt here that is going to go the longest way in preventing any sort of airfield incident. So that's all I got for us. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak, and my contact information right there. And I'll turn it back over to you all. Thank you very much.